Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the 40-year-old Star Wars saga comes to a conclusion in The Rise of Skywalker.
As Rey, played by Daisy Ridley, trains under Princess Leia, played by Carrie Fisher, elsewhere the First Order's supreme leader, Kylo Ren, played by Adam Driver, discovers that the Sith Lord Palpatine, played by Ian McDiarmid, is alive and joins forces. When the Resistance discovers this, Rey, along with John Boyega's Finn and Oscar Isaac's Poe, go in search for a Sith Wayfinder to try and locate the secret Sith world of Exegol, so they can make a last stand and defeat the First Order and the Sith for good.
It's difficult to overstate the significance of Star Wars. It's a movie that changed the way films were made and inspired countless movie makers since. If you ask anyone, chances are they'll probably remember exactly where they were when they first watched Star Wars for the first time. For me, I remember that I first watched the 1977 movie on a VHS tape recorded off TV in the mid-80s. So this was a tape from before I was even born, and even though I was watching it 4:3 pan and scale on a probably quite small television, it still captured my imagination like it did with countless audiences around the world. That's why that movie is so enshrined in pop culture. People really, really love Star Wars. So when Disney said that they were going to be purchasing the rights to the series and making a new trilogy, you can imagine the excitement there was. When J.J. Abrams directed The Force Awakens, he made a very conscious effort to invoke a lot of A New Hope in it, and so there was definitely elements that felt very familiar, and certainly it definitely felt like it was going back to basics after the prequels, but also setting up these new characters and a new story. However, things became very, very divided, as only Star Wars fans can be, with Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi, which has its adamant defenders, but also those that really, really hated it, and I'm in neither of those two camps. The Last Jedi is a movie that I respect for its ambition, and I think that Rian Johnson makes some bold creative choices there. I'm just not sure if all of them really paid off. There is some great moments in it, but also quite a few misfires, that casino subplot in particular. It's a movie that I wanted to like a lot more than I actually did, so it was a very mixed bag for me. Now J.J. Abrams returns for Rise of Skywalker, which not only serves as a capper to this new trilogy, but also the entire 40-year franchise, which is a very tall order, as well as trying to mend that broken fan base. And if there were lessons to be learned from The Last Jedi, then Rise of Skywalker took all the wrong ones. The opening crawl of Rise of Skywalker might as well have the words course correction written in it, because that's precisely what this is. It's Abrams and company going, hey, you didn't like that last one? Here's one to make it up for you. And that immediately feels like a disappointment, because for all of its faults, The Last Jedi was trying to navigate the series into some unexplored territory. Rise of Skywalker runs away from those possibilities with its tail tucked between its legs. Make no mistake, this is a full-blown retreat into the franchise's nostalgia, and that's a good way of stagnating a series very, very quickly. This movie does hardly anything to build upon its predecessor. In fact, it mostly just tries to ignore it exists. Aside from having a few basic elements carried over, it either tries to negate it or just minimize it as much as possible. Abrams is clearly more making a sequel to his own Force Awakens than he is Johnson's movie, and that is really one of the first major faults here, because, all well-written trilogies ignore their middle chapters for the most part. And that is also one of the things that becomes very glaringly apparent over the course of Rise of Skywalker, is they haven't really properly planned out where they were going with this story. Now, I know famously they didn't do that with Star Wars, not really. Of course, the whole Luke and Leia thing was something they added in hindsight, and gets a little bit awkward because of it, but even so, it did seem like they had some kind of direction, whereas this new trilogy seems to be going in different avenues with each entry, and seems to be actively contradicting itself with each one, and that is a very major problem. There's no internal consistency with a lot of the characterizations or where they want the story to go, and as such, you really get the sense that they didn't quite know what they were doing, and you can see this on screen. Instead of trying to tell a well-structured plot, the movie just crams all these different elements together because it thinks that maybe some of those things might be what the audience wants to see, and it just ends up being unsatisfying. This is especially true of the film's story, story which is very simple, even by Star Wars standards. It's essentially just a quest movie with Rey, Finn and Poe just going from planet to planet to planet in search of a MacGuffin. It makes sure that it's busy and packed full of incidents, but once you look past it, you realise just how hollow it all is. Yes, Star Wars has some great action set pieces all throughout its run, and there are certainly some great bits here, but they were always anchored towards character. That was what truly resonated with audiences. That's so painfully lacking here. There's hardly any room for the characters to breathe in this. They're just two-dimensional pawns running around after things most of the time, to the point where they're barely distinguishable. And even the previous Star Wars movies actually had a good sense of story about them. They had themes. They were about something. Even the much maligned prequel trilogy actually had a lot more to say about moral and political corruption than they were really given credit for at the time. Rise of Skywalker feels like it's about nothing. If you ask me, what is this movie about on a broad level? I couldn't answer it. I genuinely couldn't. It's just a load of stuff happening, and then it feels like nothing has happened, mostly because whenever there is a development, it's usually negated. Usually the movie backtracks on it several minutes later. It never feels like there's any real progress going on. There are characters that die. Oh wait, no, they're not dead, and so on and so forth. And as such, no tension or stakes build up over the course of the story. And Abrams' direction really doesn't help with these issues. It feels extremely hurried, especially in a very, very rushed first act, and his cinematography enhances these faults even further because the camera is constantly moving. It's whip panning, or it's moving along, or there's flashes and lens flares. It's very, very heightened and dramatic, and it's to try and show that there's something happening, there's something happening, there's something happening. After a certain point you realise, though, it's not actually happening. It's just an illusion of something being more significant than it actually is, and it just feels very exhausting and overly dramatic. If I have to give Abrams a little bit of credit, what I will say is the production design is top-notch, as you would expect from a Star Wars movie. John Williams' score is magnificent as always, the sound design is incredibly immersive, and also there's a lot of honest-to-goodness practical effects in this movie. They use puppets for the aliens a lot of the time, and I really, really like that because it helps connect it with the original trilogy while also not wholly relying on CGI like the prequels did. And also, the worlds that they create for the movie are very, very memorable. They're very dynamic and distinctive. That's always been one of the major elements that's worked about the new Disney movies, is they really try to expand upon this universe and make it feel like a grand, exotic place, and they do that in spades. And it's clear that everyone is working to their absolute hardest on this movie. I'm also very appreciative of the fact that Abrams has brought back Carrie Fisher via the use of archive footage and unused takes. Yes, they clearly designed it with the footage they had in mind, so obviously the dialogue is written around it, but even so, it's remarkably seamlessly accomplished and surprisingly moving, all things considered, because it gives Fisher a chance to send off for a character that she wasn't able to in real life. And it's a real shame because there's always going to be that what if she actually did this movie, because I do get the impression that plans very substantially changed with her passing, and as I understand it, she was going to play a very big role in this movie. And I do think that Fisher's presence does add a real sense of humanity to the movie that it's lacking elsewhere. And I think that Fisher's touch when it comes to writing on the script, she was well known as a script doctor, is very much absent in this movie as well. But all that effort only makes things worse when you realise it's been applied to such a dire script. Infamously, Jurassic World's Colin Trevorrow was kicked off of this movie citing concerns with his script, and you do have to wonder if this is what they went with. What were his drafts like? The writing here is incredibly sloppy and messy at best, and especially with regard to several key twists and reveals, almost embarrassingly bad. There are moments in this movie that are clearly meant to be on the same scale as Vader's revelation in The Empire Strikes Back, but audiences aren't going to be shocked. They're more just going to be registering complete bewilderment, if not laughter, at certain moments. Oh yes, It's that cringeworthy at times, especially with regard to the key question about Rey's parentage. If you were angry about Kylo insinuating in the last movie that Rey's parents were no one, well boy, they've got a retcon for you here, and honestly, the answer was better the first time around. This is the problem with the movie. Not only is it slapdash, it's also terribly reactionary in many ways, and as a result, it ends up feeling like a really expensive fan fiction. Like if you found the worst possible fan fiction you could find and gave it this gigantic budget and the legitimate Star Wars backing, chances are it would probably look like this. There are decisions here that genuinely make you wonder, what on earth was Abrams thinking? This even applies to small things like the way the Force is portrayed in this movie, where it's suddenly become magical healing powers. When did that suddenly become a thing that it wasn't in the last 8 movies? And as it progresses, you really start to feel for the actors who are trying oh so hard to make any of this work. In particular, Daisy Ridley and Adam Driver as Rey and Kylo, who have to navigate where this story takes them and still have it in some way make sense. And frankly, that's insurmountable even with the power of 2 of them. This is especially bad for Driver. His Kylo Ren has been one of the most fascinating and compelling characters in this new trilogy, and Driver commits to it with his usual intensity, but unfortunately, the way this movie writes Kylo is appalling, and it's a real shame. Elsewhere, John Boyega is squandered once again as Finn. He got such a great introduction in The Force Awakens, and he's such a magnificently charismatic presence, but it's pretty obvious they didn't know where to take his character in the next entries, so again, he just sits around on the sidelines doing very little in the grand scheme of things, and that's such a shame. There were so many possibilities after that first movie, and it just seems like he's standing around a lot of the time waiting for Rey to show up. But that's not as bad as Oscar Isaac as Poe gets in terms of the deal stakes. His character seems to have just disappeared at some point and been replaced with Han Solo. That's basically what he's playing through the course of this movie. It doesn't feel like he's playing the same character anymore. It just feels like he's playing a facsimile of what Harrison Ford did. That seems like a perfect example of the way they just seem to course correct by just going back to how things were in the original trilogy instead of writing new characters in their place. But at least they get significant amounts of screen time, which is more than can be said for a lot of the supporting cast, which is very crowded. Domhnall Gleeson barely makes a return as Hux in this outing. Kelly Marie Tran Rose is essentially a glorified extra, which, considering that she was one of the best parts of The Last Jedi, feels like an insult, especially because she's so peripheral in this outing, she might as well not have shown up. There's also a lot of newcomers here, like Richard E. Grant, Kerry Russell, but honestly, they don't make that much of an impression, especially because you're not supposed to be introducing loads of new characters in the finale to your trilogy. There's also a whole host of cameos, as you would expect, although I will say that I did quite like the return of Billy D. Williams as Landau Calrissian, who the film actually uses really sparingly, but actually makes him a lot more effective when he does show up. I think that's a good example of the film managing to tie in nostalgia for the past, because that's where the movie really has a lot of problems. By far, the worst aspect of this movie is Palpatine. When I heard his laugh in the teaser trailer, I thought to myself, oh no, and that turned out to be very well founded. Everything to do with this character is bad. Everything it touches is risible, and it feels like a concession. It feels like an admission of defeat on the part of the filmmakers of, oh, we didn't create a villain as memorable as this one. Oh, we killed Snoke in the last movie. I guess we got to bring back Palpatine. No! You don't! It just looks very desperate, and that's exactly what it plays like on screen, especially the way I have to bend over backwards to retroactively fit him into continuity and pretend he was the puppet master the entire time. It just makes nonsense of the whole narrative, and it only gets worse as the movie moves into the third act, and it just becomes a blatant remake of Return of the Jedi, doing the exact same thing again, with Ian McDiarmid basically doing much of the same dialogue as well, except this time it's apparently set in the middle of a rave, because apparently this needed a lot more thunderclaps for dramatic effect and not really headache-inducing. And this reiterates one of the major problems with this new trilogy in that it keeps relying on the original trilogy instead of making its own memories. It just ends up robbing this trilogy of having its own distinct identity, and then Abrams piles on loads and loads of references and callbacks all throughout the movie. And on some level, you can understand this because obviously it's meant to be the big finale, but it just ends up adding to the overall clutter of the film, and also it just keeps constantly reminding you of better Star Wars movies. It keeps trying to essentially improve itself by association, but just because you have those cameos, just because you have those callbacks, doesn't suddenly improve all the problems in your storytelling. It doesn't suddenly make us forget that we're not actually watching a very good Star Wars movie. A good fault to The Last Jedi would have improved that movie retroactively, but chances are people are going to start looking upon that a lot more fondly in hindsight once they realise that this came after it. The Rise of Skywalker is both very safe and also very disappointing, leading into the worst instincts that Star Wars has as a franchise, and is not a fitting conclusion to something that has been so culturally significant for decades. This really feels like a major letdown, and surprisingly for a Star Wars movie, it's honestly quite boring. And I know that this isn't going to be the last that we ever see of Star Wars. We know that Disney is going to keep making more of these movies, but even so, it's probably going to be the last time we see many of these characters, and it's just not a fitting send-off for many of them. And if anything, it reiterates that J.J. Abrams' best talent is in rebooting and starting stories just like he did with Star Trek, because once he has to continue them or try and conclude them, then he really goes off the rails.
The Rise of Skywalker is a major disappointment, especially as the conclusion of a once promising new trilogy. While on a production level the film remains as superb as you would expect from a Star Wars movie, the story has a number of bewildering creative decisions that will leave many audiences frustrated, especially with regards to a number of key developments that resemble bad fan fiction. The actors do their best with the material even if it doesn't treat their characters well, but Palpatine's return is awful, and his presence is the root of a number of the film's problems. It also feels like the emptiest entry in the franchise, lacking any real themes in favour of constant action set pieces and rushed pacing, hoping fan service goodwill generates emotion instead. Although Carrie Fisher is treated with grace, little else here is, leaving an unfitting close to one of cinema's most influential franchises.
If you like this review, then use your hyperdrive to get over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.